Hi, I'm John Paul, and a really warm welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be continuing with a conversation with another therapist, Darren Magee. So happy to have you on, Darren.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to chat with you.
I know you run your own YouTube channel, so if subscribers, people watching, want to go and have a look at that, maybe we'll give some detail about that. But it's general mental health and well-being that I think you cover. But I did notice that there were quite a few videos there that are around the kind of narcissistic personality. So I thought it would be really helpful to have you on. Narcissism seems to be one of those words which is on everybody's lips. So I just thought it'd be great to have a conversation about it from, what it is. And also if we're in relationship or people with narcissistic traits up high, how we can manage that in various contexts. And also, if we can get to it, looking at if we believe that we have those traits up high ourselves, what we can do about that, because I don't see that much on that, actually. There's a lot about being in relationship with people who have those traits up high and managing that sort of situation. But I just wanted to start by asking what your understanding of narcissism would be.
Well, narcissism, it's very confused. You're right, narcissist, the narcissist, it seems to be something of a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
Narcissism, if I was to put it this way, everybody experiences anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has an anxiety disorder. Okay, so
Yep.
narcissism, we all have narcissistic traits. We all have like an innate level of narcissism. And it can be quite healthy. Sometimes it's referred to as adaptive narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And all that really is, I would summarize it by saying it's really just our self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
We work hard because maybe we want to do well at what we're doing. We go on a date with someone. We hope they're going to like us.
Mm-hmm.
If we practice really hard, we train really hard, we run a race and we win the race, we believe we are entitled to that trophy because we've worked hard for it, we've earned it and so on.
Yep.
Sometimes, I've heard it said that sometimes even our narcissism at its very, very lowest, it's very basic, it's just our survival instinct. So we all have a level of narcissism. Sometimes with some people, the narcissism, if you will, it starts to increase. It's like a spectrum, just like the anxiety. It's like a spectrum. So we have a normal, healthy level, and that might move up into, someone who's just very self-absorbed. Every conversation is about them. They just like to tell you about themselves. And you just continue moving through that spectrum, if you will, that continuum, up to where you might get like a personality disorder. Now, a disorder I often think of as you think of the impact something has on someone's day-to-day functioning. Yet the impact it has on the relationship with the world around them as much as with themselves. When we get to that level, there's a lot of different things. But what you might meet is someone who has a very huge sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
They believe they are special, they are unique, they are fabulous, they are worthy of your admiration, your attention, and so on. They don't run the race and get the medal because they won. It's almost like the medal is theirs by right,
Yeah.
And if someone else wins, they obviously won nefariously. They cheated somehow,
Mm-hmm.
So there's that huge sense of entitlement. They can be very disagreeable. There is also a lack of empathy. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the biggest one that people recognize, the lack of empathy for other people. But a lack of empathy doesn't mean no empathy.
Sure.
They might have some empathy. They, again, depending on where they are on that spectrum, they might know exactly what they're doing, but they might not necessarily understand the impact it has or why someone would be upset, because don't forget, I'm entitled,
Mm-hmm.
or what I think, what I feel is much more important. Why aren't you seeing it this way? And then you get them in more dark personality types, like which we could talk about later on if you want. Sometimes they know exactly what they're doing. They get a kick out of it. They enjoy it.
Mm.
They just enjoy other people's misery, and that's maybe more a sadistic side,
Yes.
dark personality type.
Yeah.
So there is a lot going on with narcissism. I think at the extreme end of narcissism, what you have is someone with a very, very fragile sense of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Again, they're unique, they're special, all the rest of it. And I don't know if it's the right way of putting it, but I would almost call it's like a rejection of reality, which is why you get
Yes.
things like people talk about the lying, the gaslighting, the manipulation, and so on. Yes, that is to control others to some degree, but it's also to protect that very fragile sense of self.
Sure. Yeah.
Reality is crushing. They don't get a medal for turning up. They have to earn it the same as everybody else. They
Mm.
are they are unique and special, but so is the person next to them.
Yeah.
So is the person across the way going on. And it can manifest in many different ways. Most commonly, you would see someone, they're very grandiose,
Mm.
very haughty behavior. Again, the entitlement, arrogance, I guess.
Mm.
Arrogance. Then you would have the more covert type. Now they still have the entitlement. It's all the same thing. It just manifests differently. The covert type, they're often very, they're put upon. They're the poor me. You would get the people who are very altruistic. They get their attention. They get their supply, if you want to call it, from being the most generous person in the room.
Mm.
In the kindest person in the room. So it does manifest in many different ways, but essentially it's all the same thing. It's like the rejection of reality and that need to be special, that need to have validation and attention
Yes.
from people.
Yes. Is that, I remember somebody saying about narcissism, people who have those traits up high, they struggle to accept a difficult reality. And I think, I suppose that reality can be, well, I think there can be an arrogance. I didn't realize what arrogance meant till I had a look, or technically meant, which is that somebody who believes they're better than they are. And there are definitely some people, I think, who have those traits up high, and be the more grandiose narcissists, wouldn't it? Where they've become a little bit separate from the reality, what other people would say and think about them, and they manage to sustain internally by telling themselves particular stories, a sort of specialness, and to give themselves superiority, I think. But as you say, and there is often, it's compensating for a sense of worthlessness beneath. So somebody needs to, because there is worthlessness, which is not true, of course, has to go to superiority, which is equally not true. So in some ways they can flip between the two as well, quite quickly. It's also interesting you said about survival, that somebody says that that people who have those traits up high are occupying that survival part, because I can really see that they're always working out whether somebody's dangerous or not. That's the main preoccupation again to them, isn't it? That's the focus of it. The way I would look at it, the sort of model is that we have the survival part, and then we also have a part which is about the drives and rewards, but competition and comparison and winning. And then we have connection, which would be where empathy, love, someone else's reality being the same as ours. We're all unique, but we are all similar as well. I think people with highly narcissistic traits, they seem to bounce between the first two. So that and the worthlessness is that place of the sort of threat survival part, because there's no grounded sense of our worth and value there, because we're always problem finding, always problem focused. The rewards and drives is very much about comparisons with others, so needing to be better than others and appearing better. And I just think that they occupy both of those two parts much more than they do the part that's about connection and empathy. Probably physiologically, I think we're programmed to do the first two mostly, and often empathy and that kind of thing is modeled throughout life. I know where it's inborn as well, but I think physiologically those are the nature's preoccupation, is to stay alive, survival, and also to acquire more stuff and win and be better than the neighbour. So I think the thing that is often lacking, that really doesn't feel good for people in relationship with narcissistic people, is that empathy, that their reality is of equal importance, that sort of attunement. And it's really difficult, isn't it? Because if somebody falls in love with somebody who has those traits, I think they can fill those gaps in for a while. I also wonder what sort of moving on a bit, I guess, to being in relationship with somebody who has narcissistic traits, what you suggest about that, both in perhaps a romantic context and also in, say, a work context. It's always interesting to look at that for people, because I think, if you're looking at romance, the quality that most people would be looking for is to love and be loved. And if somebody is not occupying that place of connection very much at all, love is pretty much impossible. It only sits there. So it can be very distressing. What about that? What if somebody thinks they're in a relationship with somebody who has those traits up high?
Well,
What would you say about that?
well, again, even when the traits are up high,
Mm,
again, because it's a spectrum. If you think of a spectrum, what you're looking at are many different colors, many different shades, many different tones, many different blends, many different intensities. You could have someone who's maybe quite low level,
mm,
but they're still not necessarily prepared to change because what they do works for them.
yeah.
Then you might have someone who has very high traits. Now, it could be argued this is about being selfish, but uh, not necessarily. And even if it is, not for a bad reason.
Mhm.
Someone might get to the point in their life when they realize if I don't do something about this, they're going to leave me.
Mm,
If I don't do something about this, I'm not going to get that job or I won't get that promotion.
mm,
So there could be incentive to change.
mm.
It really, really depends on the individual as much as where they are on that spectrum. But when it comes to a relationship with someone, and let's say imagine they won't change, when we meet someone, we get to know each other, we go on dates. A lot of people say things like, why didn't I see the red flags? Why didn't I see this
Sure.
coming? Well, a lot of the time, you have to remember, they're not waving the flags in front of you saying, hey, look at what I'm doing.
Mm,
They're not doing that. A lot of the times it can be very subtle. Other times, I think what might be going on is, again, it's the defensive thing. I need you to see this version of me.
mhm.
And that's the bit we fall in love with.
Yeah.
But that's very hard to maintain. At the very core of all of us, I think we have this need to feel as if we are important or significant to somebody.
Mm,
We all have it. That's why we get a partner and so on. And when you feel significant and important to someone else, the world's a lovely place. There's no touching you. Everything's amazing.
mhm.
When someone is very significant to you, but your significance to them is very conditional, that's not so healthy.
Mm,
I have to, again, you meet that person, you go on that date with them, you're doing what you're doing, and you're getting to know each other. You're not seeing the red flags. If that person was to sit down and say to you, do you have friends? Right, well, I don't want you having friends because if you have me in your life, there's no room for anyone else. I have
yeah.
to be the center of your universe. What about your family? Do you get on with them? Well, you know what? I haven't even met them yet, but I've decided that they hate me.
Mhm.
So we're not going, I don't want you seeing your family either. And again, when you get into that dark personality type, it'll be difficult for me to manipulate and control you if you have healthy relationships with others. So let's rule that out. We don't want you having other people.
Sure.
And then they start saying things like, I don't like your hair like that, by the way. I prefer, blondes, or I prefer, brunettes or whatever. Cut it short or grow it long, and don't wear blue. I don't like blue. Wear black from now on. It's my favorite. If someone was talking to you like that, even on a first date, there isn't going to be a second one. So we don't see that. And what happens is we start to fall for the very, very attractive qualities. One of the things that happens towards the end of a relationship is people are maybe, they're ending it, they're trying to break away. They find that very difficult because, among other things, it's hard to separate the fact that this person does have very attractive qualities. They might be intelligent, they might have an amazing sense of humor, they might have an ability to be spontaneous. They might have, they might be very ambitious, conscientious at work.
Yeah.
And these are very attractive qualities in a partner.
I mean, they might be fun to be around, might they? And but the key aspect that could be missing or deficient there is how loving somebody
Mm.
is. I think there's a few things that will come up from me based on what you said. Yes, of course, someone may be hiding those things initially, but I think often when somebody meets somebody for the first time and is sort of falling in love, sort of involuntarily going into that connection part of themselves,
Yeah.
that place is the place of empathy and kindness and generosity and most human beings, if they fall in love, I think whether somebody's narcissistic or not, will occupy that place. Therefore, they're presenting the best of themselves, aren't they? Just naturally, they're not necessarily pretending, or that's just what they're doing. And also are in relationship with somebody who's falling in love with them, who, of course, when we're in love with somebody, we see the best of it. We give them the benefit of the doubt. So I just think it's the combination of those two can really mean that it's not that necessarily they were even showing those qualities, which I think that can make it quite difficult, can't it? Sometimes people do say they overlooked something. If they think back, there were signs of that. But I do think often people are quite different when we're falling in love. But then over time, those chemicals kind of dissipate, I think, and we revert to our kind of usual ways of attaching and being with people. And that's when those signs start to come. The other thing, I suppose, that would come up for me is funny, clever, they're all attractive qualities in other human beings, aren't they? But if somebody has highly narcissistic traits, I think the thing that isn't as lacking is to be loving, to the extent that loving is about attunement, empathy, kindness, forgiveness, whatever those qualities might be. And I also, perhaps we could talk about the kind of personality types that may get into relationship with people who have that kind of grandiose narcissism as well, because some people may never have had that in their lives, actually. I think that's sometimes also why they don't spot it. If you look back at their early experience, for example, there wasn't necessarily the attunement. There wasn't the empathy. Somebody was there and present, but it wasn't necessarily that they were being loved in sort of with the qualities that we might hope, being seen, heard, attuned to, those kind of things. So I think that can be a factor as well. That's not blaming anybody for getting into a relationship with the kind of victim blaming kind of thing, but I think that can be a factor as well.
But sometimes, again, whenever we fall for someone and we're forming relationships, now, there may be, even with the healthiest, loveliest relationships in the world, there may be qualities and little things we don't like. And sometimes we will turn a blind eye to it, and we'll hope it'll go away or whatever. Sometimes it does or whatever. Sometimes it just stays the same. Sometimes it might actually get worse. But I think sometimes, most of the time, whenever we fall for someone, some people, it's the old expression to talk about unfinished business. It's like we have unfinished business. I can't remember who it was. It was Ruth Ann Harper told me, someone had commented, talking to her, we marry our unfinished business. We might meet someone and they have very attractive qualities, but even though the little things we might not like, it's like we think we can bring out the best in them. We can, we admire the confidence, overconfidence, but we think it's confidence. We don't necessarily recognize the arrogance. We recognize that and we think I can bring out the best in them, where they can, they can be confident in this, that and the other without this bit, without the angry bit, without the vitriolic bit, without the entitled bit. So we think we can bring out the best in someone. Or we might meet someone, they could be the covert type, again, the perpetual victim, everything's so unfair and look at me, and we think we can rescue them. Because again, we see very attractive qualities in them, so we think, we can bring that out. Now, it's the thing about, again, often depends on where they are in that narcissistic spectrum, but again, with very deeply ingrained traits, there's an element of narcissism which isn't really talked about much. I've talked about it once or twice, and that's how they sometimes struggle with intimacy. Now, I'm not just talking about sexual intimacy. I'm talking about that, the intimacy where we feel safe to expose parts of ourselves, the parts of us we're not happy with, the parts of us we struggle with, our failures. We can be vulnerable if you want. We can be vulnerable with someone. People with very strong narcissistic traits struggle with that because, if you remember, they're perfect, they're flawless. Okay, now even the covert types that are saying, I'm weak and helpless, there is still an underlying, if you will, level of grandiosity. With the intimacy, to allow someone to be emotionally close, they might see the parts of me that I don't want people, the parts of me I won't even look at, the parts of me I will deny, which is why we often get the barriers, the obstacles. Someone is talking about actually their needs. I have needs too, I would like whatever. for the narcissistic person to maybe, try to meet those needs, it can almost, sometimes it might feel as if they're having to surrender some kind of power or something. I don't even know how to phrase it, but do you know what I mean? They're having to give something up. So again, what you find is that withdrawal even further, and then there's more conditions. I will give you this whenever you're more like that. Well, I am being more like that. Yes, but you're not being like that enough, or you're not thinking the right thought while you're doing it, or I need you to do this as well. So there's this never ending list of conditions that we have to meet. The love is conditional.
Yeah.
And we never ever meet those conditions. And we can sometimes, eventually someone might wake up and they realize they are just a shell of their former selves. They have given everything for little to nothing in return. Again, could be for a variety of reasons, but I do think one of the reasons, probably the biggest one, though I stand to be corrected, is that fear of intimacy, that difficulty with intimacy. Because even meeting another person's needs, you're having to acknowledge them. And even to apologize for something, well, that would have to mean you're having to admit you did something wrong in the first place. Which, again, the rejection of reality. I can't admit fault. I can't admit flaws. So it's a lot of the behavior, I think, it kind of creates a bit of a negative feedback loop in itself.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think, for some people, it's not even a won't, is it? When I realize I have done this, but I'm just not going to say sorry. I think if we see the world from that survival place, it's always victim perpetrator or victim persecutor, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or two choices. And it's usually I'm being victimized somehow. But that's if that's what our brain sees, that's what our brain sees, isn't it? And then I suppose if you look at the drives, it's about winning. So neither of those places, they're not going to want to bend the knee in an argument because they've somehow become inferior, which I suppose sends somebody into worthlessness. So both of those places, it is impossible to repair, isn't it? It's impossible to see somebody else's point of view if my only choice is to be a victim or a perpetrator. And I can also see sometimes when people have those traits up high, they either perceive themselves to be victimized, or they can quite quickly follow up and say they were a perpetrator as well. It's that very binary way of looking at things, rather than neither person was right, neither person was wrong. I have my frame, you have yours. How do we bridge? But I think those sorts of qualities do sit much more, as I say, in that part of the brain or being, which is about connection. And I think that is repair sits there. And I think those are often just absent in some people. So sometimes people resist. They sort of know they could do it, but won't. But sometimes it's just not present. We're sort of expecting something to happen that has not been installed.
And that acknowledgement of maybe, I got that wrong. I that didn't come out the way I would have meant it to, or I recognize maybe you have needs too. I've been neglecting you in a certain way. Again, I describe them as like maladaptive defense mechanisms. Yeah. They might go into the role of victim. You're now persecuting me. You're making demands on me. And when they go into the role of the persecutor, the aggressor, the victimizer, again, that inability to recognize that part of themselves, or unwillingness, it depends on the person, there's a justification for it. It's because you're this, or it's because you're that, or if you weren't such the other thing, or again, it's like everything nowadays, everything's being given a name and a label. But I thought an interesting turn of phrase was a moral immunity. There's a moral immunity. They behave any way they see fit, if you will, but that's because it's maybe in self-defense. It's because they are being victimized.
Yeah. Some people who have these grandiose traits as well, because we live in a society where to win, actually, and to lack empathy, can push people so they can bulldoze their way through into, real positions of kind of seniority, have lots of status, lots of money. That certainly happens sometimes, doesn't it? And I also think that people can, when would they get that sort of status and money? Because it, to some degree, it appeals to everybody. They can enter a world where nobody is going to particularly challenge them. I mean, their romantic partner might do, but if you're looking at work, you know, certain behaviors or a lack of empathy, people have fear for career, their bonus might depend on it. They'll surround themselves probably by an echo chamber of people who kind of agree with the values and live in that way as well. And so I think it's interesting that they can get status and money often, which distorts, I think, the perception. Nobody necessarily holds up that mirror in the way that they could. And in fact, the person that often does could be their partner, and they're thinking, well, everybody else seems to think I'm nice or admires me.
Amazing.
And it's just as well as I say, the thing that I've noticed that there's a gain often monetarily there can be in status wise from having those qualities, isn't it? If you're going to elbow your way through life, not to characterize all people with narcissism, believe you're special. If you walk into a room or go to a job, it's you the one that's going to get it. So, you know, that can sustain successful careers in certain environments, can't it? And I think once you're in that position, it can become quite disorientating. That because, as I say, other people around you are saying, you're great, I admire you, I admire those qualities that have got you through. Look at the success you have materially, financially, and then you have a partner, because the partner's demand or need, I suppose, is much more emotional, love, be loving, which is not required at work. You know, they can really look at the partner and say, well, you're being hypercritical, or this isn't the message I'm getting elsewhere. What's wrong with you? There must be something wrong with you. You know, I think I can sort of see that happening at times as well.
Yeah, and it's something you said a moment ago. Again, it's very, very key point. It's a lot of the time it's about status. So, you know, they're the funniest person in the room. They are the bravest person in the room. They are the most attractive person in the room. They're the most intelligent person in the room. They could be the most put upon, victimized person in the room. No one has it as hard as them. One way or another, it's how do they get what they often call their supply? How do they get their attention? How do they get their validation? How do they get their admiration or whatever? And if someone is in work and they are doing very, very well in work, their narcissism to some degree is serving them very, very well.
Absolutely.
Because they are climbing the corporate ladder. They're getting, you know, the family, the partner, the friends and things like that. Unless they're admiring them for the same things, because that's where they're getting their validation from. You know, you're just not getting me. You're just not understanding me. You're not seeing this the way I see me. You're not seeing, you know, and there's clearly something wrong with you and what you're asking for, which means you're weak, you're vulnerable, and you know, again, that negative feedback loop. But this is the thing, and again, I don't like to overgeneralize, because again, there's a lot of different tone shades and all the rest of it. Sometimes someone can utilize, if you will, their adaptive narcissism, their healthy narcissism, in order to be able to climb that corporate ladder. But they still have things like empathy, compassion, you know, they can look at other people, they can look at the impact this has on other people and come up with a balanced decision. They balance their work life with their home life, because, you know, their partner, their children, you know, they have needs. They need a bit of attention. They need time. They need that connection.
Yeah.
By its very nature, I believe narcissism to be destructive. It can be self-destructive, but it's very, very destructive. You might have an organization, a company. It could be a little community group. It could be, you know, a church. It could be any kind of setting with this group. And when these personality types get involved, you know, they tend to climb over everybody to get to the top. They like to own it, you know. And it's not that they want to make things better. Sometimes they might believe it's better. It's more like they want to recreate it in their own image. And that's when these things start to, if you will, they start to deteriorate. They're not what they started out to be. You know, the company, if you will, it could start going down the toilet. But of course, that's got nothing to do with the person who climbed over everybody to get to the top and their poor decisions. You know, it's obviously someone else's fault. You know, when people stop going to that community group, it's got nothing to do with the way they're treating people. Do you know what I mean? It tends to be destructive. It tends to destroy things, I believe, the way I phrase it anyway. It tends to destroy things from the inside. Now, that's families, relationships, businesses, companies, you know, organizations. Destroys things from the inside. If it can't do that, or if it's no longer able to do that, it'll try and destroy it from the outside.
Hmm.
Because again, that sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
I I should be running the show. I should be the one in charge. Or, this person left me, and that's not fair. Because I'm
Yes,
in.
yes, because I think there's very much that experience. If you're not with them, you're against them, isn't there? It's
Yeah,
kind of,
again, it's
and
that
therefore needs
binary.
to be destroyed in
Yeah,
some ways. It's the enemy if you're not alongside. Yeah.
yeah. If you're not seeing it the way I see it,
Mm.
again, I think of it. It's like all or nothing thinking. If someone is successful at something, again, very, very common trait of narcissism is envy. They believe others should be envious of them. Well, they do believe others are envious of them, but if they're not,
Mm.
they should be. And if they don't, there's something wrong with them,
Mhm.
But they're also very envious of others. So again, when you think of that all or nothing thinking, if someone is quite successful at something or somebody achieves something, it can feel as if they have taken something from them.
Mhm.
They have taken the attention, they've taken the
Mm.
credit, they've taken something. This person has something I don't have. This person can do something I can't. Again, it's something. It's not a common trait. Well, it's not. It is a common trait, but again, it's something that's not often mentioned. It's a lack of humility.
Mhm.
There is room for other people. Other people are people. Other people know things you don't.
Sure.
They can do things you can't. They have experiences you
Yeah.
don't have. But that doesn't take away from them. But again, that very fragile sense of self believes
Mm.
it does, and
Yeah.
this is where the destructive nature comes in. If they
Yeah.
can't have that, if they can't own it, it's like they try to wreck it.
And I suppose, we can see from all that how difficult it is for the people around somebody who
Mm,
has those traits up high. Also, from the point of view of perhaps working with somebody with those traits up high, how difficult it is for them too. Actual
mm,
relationship with other people it makes relationships very difficult, almost impossible if those traits are
yeah,
up very high with somebody. As you say, I think it is a spectrum for people, but relationship is impossible if somebody else's reality is not of equal importance to mine. It doesn't mean I have to agree, but if it's
yeah.
not of equal validity or importance, there is no relationship, is there? Somebody else is just an extension of me, which is
That's a
not
good
the
way.
relationship. Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. Other people are an extension of me. It's like other people are here for my benefit. And I think when it comes to the workplace, now, yes, we are going to meet people like this in the workplace.
Mm.
This is going to sound unkind, but I think it's a good way of looking at it. Sometimes what you find in work, if you're working particularly with a grandiose type, you're really working with the best way I could describe it, even though it sounds unkind. They're like Alan Partridge.
Hmm.
You know what I mean by that, Alan Partridge? The comic Alan Partridge, in the sense that he believes he's entitled. He believes he's the most intelligent in the room.
Mm.
He's the most middle class. He's the most deserving. And even way back in the 90s, when he first appeared and he was doing his chat show, going back and watching it now, I mean, Steve Coogan, I think through accident or design, I think he created an amazing character. He would start out quite well. He's the chat show guest, and he brings or the chat show host, and he brings the guests on, and he's talking to the guests. But the guests start talking about things that maybe he has no experience of,
Sure.
or how well they're doing. Or they might make even just a silly little frivolous kind of joke at his expense, and
Mm.
all of a sudden he turns.
Yeah.
Now again, it's comedy, but it's a really good illustration. And sometimes
Yeah.
when you're working with someone, that's really what you're working with. I mean, yeah, there are many different types, as I said, but when it comes to grandiose, yeah, you're working with someone who thinks they know best.
Mm.
They may have worked there maybe 2 weeks longer than you. I'll tell you something that is quite common. Again, not in every single case, but this is quite common. You will meet someone who, with people on their own level, they can be very distant from. They don't necessarily mix with them. They might, on some level, if they have to work with them, but they wouldn't necessarily go for a coffee with them or something. So there can be, and the relationship is very professional. It's
Mm.
like there's no closeness, no talking about how did you get on at the weekend. The people below them, they will either treat with contempt because they are below them,
Mm.
Or you might find them being very super helpful, trying to do things for them and sort them out and make sure they do this and giving them orders and giving them tasks and so on. Because again, it gives them a sense of control. The people above them, it's like their best friends.
Mm-hmm.
They are their best friends. They will
Yeah.
tell them all, show them pictures of their kids and tell them all about their holiday and ask them how they're getting on and do that. But the people at their own level, they would cease
Yeah.
very competitive.
Yes, and I suppose the people above are useful. So connection, I think, is often brought in to serve the drives, to enhance the chances of promotion or increase the bonus, isn't it? Which, to a degree, at work, that's possibly what quite a lot of people are doing anyway. But it is I think if that becomes a pattern of life, that I connect and I'm nice only in order to advance my career or bring my self satisfaction or make more money, then I think that gets more with an absence of, as I say, people existing in any other way, then that can be really problematic. But I suppose with a lot of things that we're saying, it does seem that it would be difficult to be in a relationship with somebody who is narcissistic. You're talking about work environments there, and often people will come to therapy, for example. Perhaps it's with a parent or a work colleague, but it can be with somebody who they've got into a romantic relationship with. And I was just wondering, from your point of view, well, for two things, I suppose, anything that you would suggest if you are in a relationship with somebody with those traits up.
Again, it depends on where someone is on the spectrum, but if someone is really, that narcissism is really cranked up high and it ain't for changing, it's difficult to do, but sometimes we have to acknowledge they're not for changing. That's different. I talk about acceptance. We accept they're not for changing now. This is the thing about acceptance and why we sometimes struggle with acceptance, because I think we look at it the wrong way around. Accepting something doesn't mean you're okay with it. And it doesn't mean you approve of it. It doesn't mean you're fine with it. It doesn't mean any of those things. Sometimes all we're doing is we're acknowledging it is what it is.
Yeah.
Now, paraphrase both Young and Rogers. It's only when we accept something that we're now free to change something. Now, so you have a look at what can be changed. Now, some people, if they want to stay in that relationship, it's really about how are you going to make it work? How are you going to make that work? You're constantly feeding someone's ego. You're giving them what they need. Is it about learning how to say no? Is it about learning about boundaries? Is it about learning different ways of communicating? This is easier, by the way, if two people are in the room. It's not so easy if there's just the one. Sometimes is it just about ending it? In which case, now, as a therapist, we can't advise one way or another, but what we can do is we can help people explore. I think, regardless of whether someone stays or goes, and again, it depends on the person where they are on that spectrum, it's really about looking at your boundaries. And boundaries, I like to summarize in just one little thing. There's multi-layered, there's many different ways of looking at it, but just summarize it by saying what's mine and what's yours. We are not responsible for what someone else thinks or feels. We're not responsible for their behavior. I said this once, I think it was in a video, got a few comments. It's like someone lifts a frying pan and they start beating themselves over the head with it and screaming, "Look at what you're making me do." But the other thing I'd say about when people do come into couples therapy, sometimes I will say to them, the most I'm going to do today is to facilitate a difficult conversation. Sometimes that's it. It's facilitating a difficult conversation. It's making sure both are listened to, both are heard, and both are understood. And what they do with that afterwards, again, is that about finding a solution, a compromise on both parts, If you meet that person who will not compromise, they will not back down, well, again, that goes back to the other person. What are their options? Do they stay where they are and just accept it? Do they accept it as it is and then decide to move forward, maybe alone? You're right, that is going to have consequences. What we often think to do is the path of least resistance. What's the easiest? What's the quickest? What's the best way out of this? And that could be backing down. That could be giving someone what they want. That could be not speaking up. That could be, it could be any number of things. But the thing about the path of least resistance is it never takes us where we want it to. It usually takes us to longer term misery.
Mm.
Which is why sometimes we have to make a difficult choice, a difficult decision. And regardless of a relationship, it doesn't matter whether it was the best thing in the world. It doesn't matter whether it was the most toxic thing you're so glad to be out of. There's no pain like heart pain.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can see that. That sort of heartbreak is definitely the top, really. I mean, in the context of grief as well and bereavement, isn't it? But the loss of something, of love, is very much one of the most distressing things that human beings can experience.
Yeah. And even then, you know, people do come out of relationships, or people have been in a workplace, a work environment, or they were brought up in a particular family that had, narcissistic behavior. It's about taking a bit of time to actually get to know yourself. And I think it's easier to do that where there's a little bit of distance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that's physical distance, geographical distance, whether that's emotional distance or whatever, it doesn't matter. Where there's a little bit of distance, I think that's when the healing can begin. And it can be difficult. I mean, we talk about difficult things in therapy sometimes. We talk about them in ways we wouldn't normally talk about. Something I say to people, it's not that it fixes everything. It's not that it gives them a quick fix. If there is that little bit of space, and if they are coming out of something, it can be hard to move on because of the emotional entanglement.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you focus on moving forward. Now, that's not always easy to do, but you find little ways to move forward. And as you move forward, sometimes the moving on starts. There's a guy I talked to him about last time, maybe about a year ago, Jay Reed. He has a channel, and he has a wonderful expression that, you know, someday I'm going to claim I came up with it. It's such a good expression. He says, what you do is you learn to live in defiance.
Right.
You live in defiance of the person who told you that maybe having needs of your own was selfish.
Mm-hmm.
That saying no was a bad word. You know, you start to do the things that were maybe disapproved of.
Sure.
You go and you learn that new skill. You go and you meet new friends.
Mm-hmm.
You know, change your diet, your taste in music, whatever it happens to be. You start to wear the clothes that you like. You change your hairstyle. I just love the way he phrased it. You live in defiance.
And then I suppose on the basis that at some point your feelings catch up. So you start to feel good about those things, start to feel good about yourself, start to enjoy those things. And then the heartbreak, the whatever regret starts to fall away.
I would say it starts to dilute. It starts to lessen. It's not that we don't feel a regret. And, you know, it can go over time, especially if we meet new people, healthy relationships. We do things in our own best interest. I think with that distance, I think things start to dilute. We're doing things in our own best interest, things that we enjoy. It starts to dilute to the point where we're maybe able to see it slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
We can still feel regret. We can still feel those things. But that part of us that might be still stuck there starts to maybe, you know, either fade away or it maybe just catches up with us. The emotional entanglement, as I say.
If you're looking at the person being uncoupled from and somebody who does have those traits up high, you would say, I mean, we have been talking, as I say, about how difficult it is in relationship. Of course, empathy for the person who is in relationship with that person, how difficult it is for them. I also think that somebody who as I say, has those traits up high does make it very difficult to have any kind of relationships in life. They might be materially successful, all those things, but for most of us, that doesn't have a sort of sustaining sense of worth and value. So often people will, at some point, be looking around thinking, I thought these kind of more, the things that come from these narcissistic traits were going to make me happy and consistently, but I realize that's not the case, but I'm not sure what else to do in some ways. Somebody who has those traits up high, is there anything that you would say to them to focus on or pay attention to?
Yeah, there are different, again, many different approaches, but in CBT terms, there is what's known as behavioral activation.
Okay.
So we start to behave in a certain way, so we might start to model empathetic behavior.
Sure. Yeah.
And we can do that and it's not that we're being false. It's not that someone's being false and they're just playing a game. No, they're starting to demonstrate empathy. If they don't understand it, you know, help learn a bit of active listening.
Yeah.
You know, so we can ask things that will help me to understand why this is important to you because I might not get it.
Yeah.
again, with narcissism, there's this need for validation. I don't think that's the right word. I think it's more collusion. They want someone to collude with their fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe said, to validate the other person's feelings. Now, when we validate someone, this is why I think validation isn't always the right word when it comes to narcissism. When we validate someone, it doesn't necessarily mean we agree with them.
Well,
And it doesn't
completely.
necessarily
Yeah.
mean we understand them. It just means we're
Yeah.
acknowledging that's how you feel about it.
Yeah.
So you can look at things like that and encourage a bit of curiosity as well. Being curious. We don't always have to know the answer to everything. Not just what's going on with the other person, but what might be going on with me as well. Trying to find a little bit of self-reflection. Something is uncomfortable, something is emotionally painful, emotionally difficult. Well, why is that? Again,
Yeah.
I'm going to quote Ruth Ann Harper as well. One of her bits of advice is go and learn to do something that you're absolutely crap at. you know,
Okay.
because what you're doing, when she said that, I thought that was a wonderful idea, because what you're doing is you're learning a bit of humility.
So you don't have to be superior in the environment that you're
No.
in, I suppose. And yeah.
Go and make a point of doing something you're bad at. Go
Mm.
and, something you know nothing about. You don't have to be the best. You don't have to win. There's going to be people there that are better than you. They're going to be in different levels. And if they have a joke at your expense, do you know what? Maybe take it in the good humor that it's meant at. We don't have to turn into Alan Partridge again,
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
Pay attention as well. And I say this to everybody. You pay attention because we pay attention not just to the things that work, because we can build on those, but we also pay attention to the things that don't work.
Mm.
Because we have to learn from what doesn't work.
Sure.
With narcissism, what you often find is like it's a quick fix. What gets me what I want right now? Sometimes it can be impulsive. What makes me the alpha in this? It doesn't matter what you're doing. You may be working hard, but what you're doing is you're making everybody's life around you a misery. You're slandering, you're sabotaging other people's work, and all of this is blowing up in your face. You're no further on.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't work for the person who's narcissistic. So in terms of relationships, does it? So they might get through and get on and get a promotion potentially, but as far as their sense of connectedness, it could be isolated, feel lonely in environments. So it isn't. There is a significant incentive just for self, isn't there? An empathy for self, or developing that empathy for self. If somebody lacks empathy for others, they may certainly realize the impact of things on themselves a bit, but they will not have empathy for themselves, I don't think. I will often notice that. Just as somebody did say about developing empathy and exercise for doing that as well, is that when you're talking to people, try to notice facial expressions and imagine what that facial expression means and what they're feeling. Which I quite like, just quite a practical thing. So if somebody has those traits up high and they're in a conversation, what does that facial expression mean? Is somebody feeling fearful? Are they feeling love, excitement? Are they connected at that point? Sadness, or nothing? That again is developing that connection part, I think, which is putting more energy into that part, which is trying to imagine what somebody else feels like, which I think is what a key part of empathy, isn't it? I use my imagination to imagine what somebody else feels like, whether I get it right or wrong. So that it doesn't necessarily matter. It's that I'm trying to use my imagination to do that. And I think somebody with narcissistic traits up high is often not doing that unless that person's happiness or otherwise serves their purposes just of itself.
What you might find is they might be watching someone and studying them very closely. They're not necessarily listening. What they're doing is they're maybe picking out key phrases, and they are maybe looking at tone of voice and stuff like that. But what they're filtering through is they're trying to read, what are you thinking of me right now? Because if what somebody's saying is, critical, and it could even be constructive, or it could even be a disagreement, it could be anything. Again, what they might be saying is attack. You're attacking me, or you disapprove of me, or you're telling me I'm a worthless piece of crap. Again, engaging in that active listening, and it's hard to do. It's hard to do for most of us. When someone's talking, it's like we're not listening to them because we're already thinking of an answer. Something I would say to people is you have to pay attention to yourself, your own needs, things like that. But you also have to pay attention to other people because, your rights, demands, your needs and all that What do they cost others? So what you're trying to find is something in the middle to be able to negotiate. And that's not
Absolutely.
always easy to do. Sometimes that can take a long time to find that, because I think going to either extreme is not good.
What you mean overly empathizing with others at your expense being the other
Yeah.
extreme? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that can be one of the personality types. Again, I know it's a risk of generalization. We think that gets into relationship.
And so, yeah, you might have that person who over empathizes. We don't like to hurt people's feelings. We don't want to, we don't want to be seen as the villain. We don't want to do that. And this person, they might be mean, but they're going through a lot. And if I was to bring out the best of them,
Sure.
we need to pay attention to ourselves as well as the other person,
Yeah.
and try and find something in the middle.
Yes.
Saying no to somebody is not, it's not an act of abuse to say no to somebody.
Mm.
It's not being selfish to say what you're asking for is unreasonable.
Yeah.
And it's not being coercive to say, well, if you're asking me for that, what will I get in return?
Mm. So as you say, in relationship with somebody who has those traits up high, boundaries are an important thing. This is where I end and you begin, always grounding your existence as another person, and not in a confrontational way, but just that you exist and you have your needs and wants, and they're separate and they're different. Just a statement of fact. Just the other thing, finishing off on people who have narcissistic traits. I remember somebody said as well that if you think you have those traits up high, they said to do sort of creative and artistic things. There's an emotionality that comes with those, and they are an expression of emotion, and seeing other people's, it's often, whether it's music or art, is an expression of emotion. So in some level you're connecting with yourself, but also with others on a much more emotional level, which I thought was an interesting, it sort of stayed with me afterwards.
I think that sounds quite good. Yeah, absolutely. Be creative. We can journal, we can write short stories, we can write poetry, even you think of music. We listen to like rock music or something like that, and we tend to have a lot of energy. And some people might put on, I don't know, a bit of, I was going to say disco music, whatever the hell they call it these days, because it gives them a bit of motivation, to try and get through what they're doing. Whenever we're feeling upset, we might put on something melancholy, so there is something, and human beings, I think we are designed, put together, evolved, whatever term you want to use, to like nice things. We like delicious food. We like beautiful sunsets. We like nice looking people. And some of these things, they can influence our moods, they can inspire us. And whenever we start to create beautiful things, now, even if what we're creating could be quite dark, if you know what I mean, we are still getting something out there.
Yes, and it's often from an emotional place, isn't it? Which I think is the thing about, occupying that world more. It helps us to understand other people's emotions more, perhaps. We connect with other people through music and lyrics, don't we? If you don't know them. But the fact that they sang that thing and we think, oh my gosh, that was what I felt too, is a way of connecting with others, and that sort of shared experience, which again is not that consistent with having those traits up high, I think. So I can see why. You were saying there about ways we can self-regulate, I suppose, with art, for example, but one of the things as well is having a co-regulating relationships, isn't it? And I think fundamentally for me, that's the difficulty with having those narcissistic traits up high, is that it makes co-regulating relationships very, very difficult. So we lose the ability to have that in life, which is very distressing, not only for the person on the kind of receiving end, but also the narcissistic person themselves. So certainly working on it is the thing to do, because at least then we can have healing, nurturing, supportive relationships, which I think is so fundamental to all of us, really, and our well-being. Again, thank you so much. It's been great. If people want to listen to the channel, that kind of thing, or anything else, if you want to contact you, can you just say about the channel? And
my channel. I started my channel during lockdown. I talk about mental health, relationships, personalities, things like that. I left my channel. I know you've mentioned about the narcissism. A lot of the stuff I do is about narcissism. And that's because I had left my channel open. I thought a good way to get engagement was to ask the audience what topics they would like me to cover.
Yeah.
The majority of the questions I get are about narcissism. And I think something you'd said earlier on, it is something of a buzzword, and it seems to be something more and more people are aware of. But again, it's one of those things. I think the word's misused a lot of the time. So what I aim to do on my channel is, if I'm talking about it, talking about narcissism, what it is, but also what it isn't. You know, I talk about the traits I mentioned earlier, you know, the disagreeableness, the sense of entitlement, you know, the lack of empathy, the haughty behavior, and so on. They're long-term and they are consistent, that they are not just once in a while, because every single one of us can be disagreeable. Every single one of us has a sense of entitlement. Every single one of us may lack empathy in certain situations. They're long-term. So that's one of the things I do endeavor to do. Sometimes I don't get it right because I'm not perfect, but I do hope I do that. So yeah, if anybody wants to have a look and see what they think.
Take a look. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And you take care, Darren.
Will do. And hopefully we could do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be great.